Hello, peoples of the internet, I'm Mo, and I am here today to do the 25 bookish facts about me tag video thing. I think this was originally a tag. I've been seeing a lot of people doing it, but I haven't really seen people tagging each other, so I don't know if it's a tag or not, but I'm gonna do it anyway, because it sounds like a lot of fun. So hopefully the sound quality is okay today. It is storming outside. I'm not sure if you guys can hear that, but if you can hear it, that's why. Otherwise, I'm going to get right into my 25 facts. Fact number 1 is I got my love of science fiction and fantasy from my mother. I grew up in a house with bookshelves full of fantasy books and sci-fi books, many of which I see you guys talking about and think, now why didn't I read that when I was growing up and it was in the same house as me? Yeah. Number 2, I buy purses dependent on how many books I can fit inside of them. So the smallest purse that is acceptable is one that fits my Kindle and one other thing. Bigger is generally better though. More books is always a good thing. Number 3, I make bookmarks while I listen to audiobooks. Ironically, I mostly read electronic books and therefore do not use any of these bookmarks. Yeah, but I do give them away. So I'm currently in the middle of making a few. Here are some of my in-progress bookmarks. I'm not sure if you can see that I'm working on. We'll see when I get those done. I do have an audiobook at the moment, maybe soon. Number 4, I love genre poetry. That being said, there's not a lot of it out there, but if I can find a good science fiction or fantasy poem or poet who tends to write those things, it makes me so happy. So if you guys have any recommendations for those type of poets or poetry books, please leave them down in the comments so I can go check them out. Number 5, I prefer to read long poems as opposed to short poems. Short poems I like them, but I don't love them. It's like there's not enough in there for me to really just latch onto it. This is probably because I really like to have stories in my poems. I much prefer narrative poetry to other sorts of poetry, and narrative poetry does tend to be longer. I have a particular liking for epic poetry. Number 7, I read while walking, sometimes to my detriment. I don't do this as much as I used to, but growing up, especially in junior high and high school, I lived not too far away from my local library, and so I used to walk into the library most days during the summertime, and I could just never wait until I got home to start reading the books that I had checked out from the library. And so there are a number of light poles on the street where the library is that I may have had a few run-ins with at some point. I take my Kindle with me everywhere, absolutely everywhere. It's very rare that I will leave the house without my Kindle in hand. This is partially because it is a Kindle Fire, so it has apps and things as well as just my books on it, but it's mostly because of my books that it comes with me, because you just never know when you're gonna have to wait for something and want a book to read. Number 10, in spite of the fact that my mother is both a fantasy and a science fiction fan, I grew up reading fantasy books, but I didn't really start picking up science fiction books until I was in college. And now I'm remembering lots of science fiction books that were on her shelves that I kind of want to swipe sometime when I'm around there, maybe, if she lets me. Number 11, I love the highlight function on my Kindle. I highlight stuff all over the place, and I love that I can just hit the thing and it brings up all my highlights and I can quickly scan through and find the stuff that I wanted to find. I don't know if this means that possibly I would be a person who used tabs if I read more physical books. Maybe. I do not highlight in physical books, but I will use pencil and I will underline things when I'm reading my own physical books versus borrowing them, obviously. But yeah, I like to make notes. Number 12, don't be mad at me. I dog-ear my books. Only my books, not other people's books. But yeah, I just don't tend to remember things like bookmarks at all. I remove books from my Kindle once I have read them. This is mostly because I have a lot of books on my Kindle that I have not read yet, and the more I am seeing my unread books, the more excited I am about reading those versus like rereading books that I already have read, and it just makes it a lot easier to find things. So I just put my read books like back in the cloud, and I can re-download them later if I want to reread them, but this helps to encourage me to read more of my TBR versus rereading older things, which I do still do sometimes, but it helps me not to forget about my TBR, basically. Number 14. I have loved books since I was a very young child, before I could read myself, and I used to drag my dad into a chair and force him to read these different books to me. And as a child, obviously, I was making him read the same books over and over again, because kids don't get tired of things. And so in order to amuse himself, he would like change things or like say things on the wrong pages or like end a word early. And apparently I had memorized all my favorite books, and I would get very mad at him when he did this, and I would flip it back and I would make him do the pages over. And so he was probably kind of glad when I learned to read on my own and didn't force him to do that anymore, but you know. Number 15. When I was in college, I was, like many college students, without a lot of money for buying books. And so because I couldn't afford to buy books, I read long classic novels in my internet browser on Gutenberg. So I did not have a Kindle yet at this point, so I couldn't download them there. And so I just went on and I read Sense and Sensibility that way. I read North and South that way. I read, oh, there were more. I don't remember. But I read a lot of really long classic novels in my browser, which I do not like, by the way. It was a terrible way to read books. It's still a terrible way to read books, but it's better than not reading books. So, yeah, you do what you have to. Number 16. I generally dislike shopping for just about anything except for books. And like many of the rest of you, shopping for books is for me slightly dangerous, at least where my pocketbook is concerned. Number 17. When I do go book shopping, I prefer to shop at used bookstores versus bookstores that sell new books. Mostly, I think, just because it feels so much more of an adventure, because you just don't know what's going to be in a used bookstore. Like a new bookstore, you can go into 5 different ones that sell new books, and they're going to have pretty similar titles. They might have slightly different things, but if you go into a used bookstore, it's like a surprise every time. You don't know what you're going to find. Plus, you can find these really pretty old editions that you would just never find at Barnes & Noble because they're out of print. So I bought this one at a used bookstore this past summer. This is A Child's Garden of Verses. It's poems by R.L. Stevenson. But it's, firstly, beautiful. And then on the inside, it's also got all of these wonderful little Art Nouveau prints, like, everywhere. And, yeah, used bookstores, guys. Number 18. I have recently discovered that I love short fiction. And it's not that I've recently started reading short fiction, it's that I've recently realized that I read short fiction, which is kind of weird. But because I tend to read short fiction in collections, I've always just kind of thought of them as books and never really made much of a differentiation between like collections and novels in my brain. I was just like, I read a book, until I started making YouTube videos and then had to talk about them in more detail. And I was like, oh, I read lots of short fiction collections compared to some other people on YouTube, at least. Number 19. I repeatedly got in trouble in middle school for reading under my desk during math class. Number 20. By high school, I had learned my lesson, and I would just do my math really fast and then use the rest of the class time to read my book, and I read the entire Silmarillion during Algebra 1. Number 21. I don't like dust jackets. Not because they aren't pretty, because some of them are very pretty, but I find I have a tendency to wreck dust jackets, and so I just prefer when they're not there. So hardback books should be pretty without them, in my opinion, because they're not going to continue remaining pretty if they need the dust jacket for it in my house. Yeah. Number 22. One of my biggest bookish pet peeves is when they make paperbacks with that sort of like plastic over the cover, and then it starts peeling off on the edges like this. It's just not okay, you guys. It makes me so sad. Number 23. I love classics, but I really disliked most of the classics that I had to read in school. The exception being most of the Shakespeare that I studied were plays that are some of my favorites, but the other sort of literary classics that I read, I mostly didn't like. Not necessarily because I didn't like the writing. The writing was good. They just tended to be sorts of stories that didn't interest me, or I just really disliked all the characters. And so the only classics that I read or studied in school that I actually remember liking are Macbeth, Julius Caesar, and Much Ado About Nothing, all of which are Shakespeare plays. So yeah, maybe that says something about me and Shakespeare, I guess, or just about how awesome Shakespeare is, more likely. Number 24, possibly the most shocking item on this list. I have never read Harry Potter. I was kind of busy reading Lord of the Rings and things when it came out, and I just kind of never got around to it. I do plan on reading it at some point, because I feel like it's kind of an important part of my cultural education at this point. But we'll see when that happens. And number 25, one of my dreams has always been to have a set of bookshelves with a sliding ladder, because sliding ladders are awesome. And yeah, basically that. So those were my 25 facts for the 25 Bookish Facts About Me video. If you guys have any facts about yourself that you would like to share down below, or any other comments, light up the comment section. Love to chat with you guys about it. Otherwise, I will be seeing you all in my next video. Bye.